the panel have any comments, or I don't know if you've been following. I mean, certainly in London, there have been lots of issues around people almost holding their own events in parks, and that not necessarily being particularly helpful. Lots of litter and related antisocial behaviour. Is there a relationship between those unofficial events and the park events that we saw last year and in preceding years, do you think?
Well, certainly, I'll just quickly, and then Tony looks like he's going to ably. I think from Sheffield, well, I mean, obviously we've been, like everybody, I think, been quite limited in our range from when we've been going out. There's not been events per se, but there's been lots of people getting together and bringing as much litter as seems to be humanly possible to carry into the park. And I think there's also some, I mean, not related to events, but this kind of idea that there is this right to use parks when people want to use them. And I was, I thought our playgrounds were open last weekend, and actually they weren't. People had brought bolt cutters and had opened them themselves. So I think there is something about this idea of being able to use the park and using it as the setting for what people want to do. And now, if that is a perceived thumbs up to go out and socialise, then parks is one of the first places that it's going to happen. But in terms of the London perspective, let me, Tony, you're probably better able than me to answer.
All I was going to add was, you can hear me. All I was going to add was that unauthorised events were going on, well, pre-COVID, and they are a growing trend. I mean, that there's fodder for you academics to work on, because of the rise in social media. It makes these sorts of things possible now when they never were. And I think we're living in a very unusual time, because even though parks have been open throughout the pandemic, very few have been closed. I think for a lot of people, it's been the only let out for them. And I know from working with colleagues who are running the parks, they were looking forward to when the pubs would open again, because people would go there rather than to take their stuff to the parks. But I think it's a trend that we're going to see more of. It's related to the whole events debate, but I think it's nuanced because it's unpredictable and incredibly hard to manage. So I think going forward, I think because people have seen particularly the younger people, have seen these spaces as a release valve. And in fact, some research carried out in June saw that I need to check the actual age range, but it was the young adults are using their parks a lot more than they ever used to. And I think that's an encouraging thing. So I haven't entirely answered the question, but I think that there are a lot of issues.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we've got anyone from Hackney here, but it's been interesting to me how they've been certainly communicating about some of those unauthorised events. They seem to be saying, our parks are not festival venues, they're for everyone. So they almost seem to be communicating the idea that actually, hang on, these types of uses are quite exclusionary. And I don't know if they're trying to suggest that, they don't use their parks and open spaces as much for formal festivals and events as other boroughs. But it's been quite interesting, some of the communications around that, almost suggesting that, they don't, this idea that, they don't consider their parks and open spaces as venue spaces, and therefore, they see them for everyone. And I don't know if that's just their own particular, borough council's perspective, but that's again sort of communicated some link between what we've seen in London Fields and these other spaces and what we've seen in previous years as regards events in parks. I don't know if there's anything, Goran, in the chat that we might want to respond to. I know some people are talking about, I know there's a point that Gail made on the chat about, are we seeing a return to previous sort of cultures or rave cultures where, these sort of unlicensed events were much more common, and maybe there's nothing that new about them, and maybe it's a sort of revival of that sort of tradition. But I think Tony's point about the fact that parks have become a replacement for social infrastructure, pubs, but also restaurants and cafes and community centres and gyms. And so all those sorts of venues were hosting activities that have been sort of displaced into parks to some extent, haven't they? So certainly when I've been in parks recently, there's been lots of children's parties and even like baby showers and these sorts of events, which presumably in the past people would have hired a bit of space in a restaurant for, but they're just taking them into their local park. So those sorts of informal events are quite interesting. And again, there's a different dynamic surrounding those events. And again, I don't think they're particularly problematic if people clear up after them, and as long as they're not playing sort of loud music. But there's definitely been a different sort of event happening in parks over the last few weeks compared to the ones that we were seeing last summer. And I suppose one issue we've tried to deal with in our research is this question of whether some of the large commercial events displace some other events. So actually one problem with having quite a heavily programmed park with lots of paid entry events is there enough room for the free stuff? So I know, for example, I think maybe in like Gunnersbury Park, which I've looked at a little bit in the past, that used to host the Mela, which is a big free event. But then now, because that park has some large festivals, there isn't really space and time for both the Mela and all these new music festivals. So the Mela's the one that's been bumped out. And so there's that issue about this sort of dynamic between paid for events and more community oriented free events. And I think we made the recommendation in the report that, ideally maybe one should help to pay for the other. But again, it's not really always easy to achieve that, in that sometimes they are sort of mutually contradictory. They're not necessarily things that you can do together. And obviously, even if you do that, there's just a greater critical and massive events happening, and that actually mean that people who don't want events either paid or unpaid in their parks are even more annoyed because there's less time where the park is just free of any programmed activity. What about, I don't know, moving forward to sort of future sort of ideas? I don't know, how does the panel see park events sort of evolving, after the crisis? So, I mean, there's been lots of things written about the end of events and sort of, and lots, again, just like in other spheres, thinking about whether or not we should avoid a return to the normal and to the pre-COVID sort of situation. What do we think might happen next?
I'll speak up. I mean, one of the things I've questioned myself during the lockdown and as we've been easing and seeing how crowded the parks are, is just where are these people usually? Where do they usually go? And are they going to go back there? Like you said, are we going to try to return to some normal, or have we actually kind of awakened something in people where they recognize that, hey, these things I used to do elsewhere are now I want to go to my park and I want to keep going there. So I think that's still very much to be seen. Does this heightened demand and awareness of our parks and green space continue, or, as things open up and hopefully stay open up, backsliding, do we see people kind of go back to the way they were?
But will people be more resistant to these large-scale events because they've been so appreciative of having open space where they can get some fresh air and exercise? So I think some people are arguing that maybe now that there will be less appetite for these big events because people are even more appreciative of open space, open in terms of, in its various dimensions. Do you think that is possible?
I wonder how much is connected to the kind of broader public space. So for example, I'm a runner, and the parks near me have largely banned runners during the lockdown. So I've had to find different routes to take, and I've actually found some very pleasant routes. But as the cars start to come back, I kind of want to go back to the park now. And so to me, it's all very entangled with, you're more appreciative of those spaces and therefore want to go to them more and have maybe be disrupted less by large scale events. But what other kinds of uses are now happening in that? And that's, have you gotten rid of the runners and the cyclists, and now it's different?
No, and it's true that people seem to have found I certainly have around me, found new green spaces because you were sort of, had more time maybe, or you were looking for new sort of opportunities and then actually, I don't know, maybe that's good in that people don't necessarily just go to the obvious destination park, and therefore, they've found the alternatives, and that may mean that we can accommodate, different types of uses because people are aware of the range of different options that are available to them locally. and I know things like Go Parks London, that's the whole idea of this new sort of website in London, which is trying to make people more aware of different types of green spaces that are not just the obvious ones, but some of the more subtle or less visible green spaces around them, and get those being used. But I don't know what the rest of the panel, anyone else wants to sort of second guess the future? Nicola, you were...
Well, yeah, I just following on from Meredith's point, I totally agree. It was, I mean, our parks were all still open, and so running and things was fine in the parks. But I think what was also interesting was I saw lots more people out in the streets in my area, and exploring. So I think there is something about the connections between green spaces, or connecting greener routes, or that potential where we're seeing now, large bits of ring roads and main busy roads being sort of now being segregated off for slower traffic for cyclists and for pedestrians. I think that is something that has got a part to play, and that parks have got something, and green spaces more generally. If people are appreciating, they've had that time, I'm hoping, I don't know, probably unrealistically and naively, but people have appreciated the quiet, people have appreciated those more natural elements in our urban areas. Whether that is just something that is called for more, that maybe people aren't going to go back to the gyms, I don't know, and they are more going to be happier to do some of these things outdoors. We've not had the summariest summer, so I think it's not kind of to turn people off completely going out and doing things in their green spaces. So that could be, again, I know there's often a lot of naivety in the things that I kind of talk about, and kind of then get tested out of when I do the research. But I also wonder whether it might lead, like you say, there's been lots more people going into parks. We know that that's true. And would that then lead to some of these friends groups, the dynamics of those friends groups changing and the user groups changing? Will we get more of an influx of younger people coming in potentially? We've certainly seen it in allotments around where we are, lots more people getting into allotments, but those waiting lists aren't really long anymore. People are out there doing it, and there's the dynamics and the demographics are definitely changing. That might be something else that changes as well.
I wonder, Tony, thinking about this sort of commercial dimension, if local authorities are going to have even less money going forward, and if budgets are going to be even more stretched, are we going to see even more pressure on them to put on, these events? I mean, if that's the most obvious source of revenue for some and the most lucrative for some, when people have got used to being in large crowds and things again, obviously that will take some time, but will there be even more pressure on local authorities to exploit and utilise their open spaces as event venues?
I think because the gradual return to a new normal is going to take time, I think local authorities and the public are going to be nervous about going to large-scale events. And what and even though there is the financial pressure because the lack of income, that won't be the deciding factor. It's more what is achievable in the coming months and years. And I think perhaps we'll see festivals re-evolve themselves, and we'll probably see more smaller events of shorter duration having less impact on the green spaces, which I think would be welcomed by all. And maybe these larger festivals will revert to being out of London in big fields like they have done and previously used to, and to other locations. But whatever happens, I think these events will become more expensive because of the additional requirements of staging these events and social contact and all that. And that raises a whole issue about equity, not just, there's a whole debate about equity of access to green space. And that brings up Meredith's very important point about it's the links between the green space, between the parks, it's the green infrastructure which really matters. But it also raises the issue of, ability to attend these things is down to ability to pay. And that's a real conundrum.
Do you think local authorities have sort of realised how precarious sort of event funding is? So we know that some London boroughs are very reliant on event income to almost subsidise their entire parks budget. You know, we've got some examples where almost the entire parks budget is paid for by 2 or 3 very large events. So do you think those boroughs are now thinking again, and not just in the short term to try and deal with that situation, but thinking actually maybe we got it wrong and that actually this isn't a sustainable funding model for parks?
I think a simple answer is yes, but it's not a simple issue, because you could apply this thinking to parks that don't hold events, but they raise money by cafes and other concessions that they have in the park. Those two have been wiped out. And it's back to that point about, because parks are not a statutory service, they've been pushed into this position of being able to keep services, even to a basic level of quality. They've been pushed into a corner, and there's now no safety net for them. The most vulnerable parks in London, and I suspect across the country, are the independent park trusts, who've been able to become independent because they are bringing revenue streams from outside. Lots of them are in dire situation, and some of those I expect will go back to being under the control and of the local authorities, because they are the safety nets. That's where the buck stops. And
so it's actually the governance model as much as the funding model that's now being challenged. Actually, that whole governance approach is now under question, because that approach was reliant on this idea that parks could generate their own finances effectively.
They could pre-COVID-19, yes. And Meredith's point earlier about making parks a statutory service, it's not a silver bullet. It won't bring new money. It really won't. There are more pressing needs on council services. That's the reality. And although parks provide so much benefit from health and well-being and all that, getting money from those funding streams is like getting blood out of a stone.
I know we're moving towards the end. We promised an hour, and we're not going to go on too much longer. But one final question. Again, one of the recommendations that seems to sort of been relatively well received is this idea of getting community and user groups actually putting on their own events and activities in parks. So I just wondered if you could, one or two of the panel members could say something about how could we make that happen? I mean, what is sort of preventing that from happening at the moment? And do we need to revise procedures, or how do we actually skill up communities and users to do that? What are the sort of obstacles that are preventing local groups actually putting on events which would have more inclusive and more ambitious social policy goals?
I did allude to it earlier on. I mean, I do think that just knowing how to go about holding an event, just knowing how to kind of jump through whatever hoops it is, that as a first kind of issue, that is difficult. I mean, that's where friends groups or user groups who've got experience of doing that can help. Are, you know, where local authorities are strapped, not just now because most of their budgets are going on clearing up all the litter that people are leaving behind in unprecedented sort of volumes, but also long-standing effects of austerity mean that that skill set, that person who you would go to in the local authority currently might not be there. And at the beginning of the COVID crisis, they were often being redeployed to other parts of the council as well. So I think that capacity, you can't just presume that it's there. And even where big, I don't know, heritage lottery projects have funded people in those posts, they're often, you know, for a short amount of time. So I think, again, not answering your question at all, I think there are just real challenges to kind of making that happen. And it's both you know, if people have got the time to be able to go and look at all the documentation to find out how to do it, great. But, you know, some of those people may generally be the retired people with more time on their hands, and maybe they're familiar with those sorts of documents. That's not for everybody, and that's not for every part of the city. So, I mean, we've talked in the past, and we've had some things going on in Sheffield where groups sort of twin across the city, so they might be helping share skills or, you know, things that have worked well in their park with places across the city. But, you know, I don't know if there is anybody from Sheffield here, but sometimes you know, there is also a feeling of being in competition with one another, you know, particularly if you're after that attention from the local authority or that help to try and get funding for not just an event but any kind of sort of things going on in the park. So it's complicated. Yeah, and I'm sure there are there are other people. I can see some of the comments that corrected me in the chat already. You're right, these events are professional. There are people who've got real skills for that, and maybe it's not just about seeing community groups to be able to do that, but making that, getting back to that.
This is a new reality of hosting online meetings where you're getting questioned while you're talking. There's people actually sort of
people who know far more about this.
What you're saying, yeah, no, but it's really good, and there's some great stuff in the chat. We'll have to find a way of capturing that, and there's some really useful comments there. I don't know if anyone's got any final comments they'd like to make about the issues we've talked about today, or about what we might do differently going forward. Any final observations from the panel? Tony, I need to unmute you.
My view is that it's a really challenging situation, both in terms of London being a large, highly populated city with a limited number of green spaces. And they try to do all things for all people, and they can't do it all at the same time. So they need to be managed. And it saddens me that that we can't find a way through, that we can have some events, I'm not saying all events, but some events, and through dialogue, and this is why we need the transparency of local authorities, which we're encouraging, to find a way that we can have some events, and instead of falling into two camps of them and us and wasting energy on just fighting each other, but find ways that we can have a variety of different events. And you said something right back at the beginning, which is, I think, really important and partly answers your last question, is about enabling local communities to hold their own events is a great one. And it's not just the event itself, it's the process is just as important as the outcome. But the resources to help that have been taken away. There used to be outreach people helping to facilitate that.
And grants. There used to be grants for people to put on like sort of really progressive events and things. And I mean, I think Camden still offers them, but very few other London boroughs now offer those types of grants. Yeah,
I've said enough.
No, that was really helpful, and I think we're going to try and draw things to a close. So I just wanted to say thank you to Nicola, to Meredith and Tony for their contributions today. It was really kind of them to agree to reread the report and give up their time this afternoon to discuss everything with you.